I live in a mid-rise apartment building in the city. It's one of those places where you recognize your neighbors' faces but don't know their names. The kind of anonymity that comes with urban living. New Year's Eve last year was the same as usual. People heading out to parties, couples dressed up and laughing as they waited for rides in the lobby. I was staying in. No plans, just me, some takeout, and a movie. It had been a tough year. A breakup in the spring, a job that paid the bills but left me drained, and a general sense that the world was spinning too fast. Staying in felt safe, comfortable. Or so I thought. Around 9 p.m., I heard voices in the hallway, muffled but close. I assumed it was my neighbors down the hall. They liked to pregame before they went out, and I was used to the occasional whoops and laughter bleeding through the walls. But then there was a knock at my door. Not a polite knock. It was heavy, insistent. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it didn't sound like a neighbor just dropping by. My pulse quickened as I crept to the peephole and looked out. A man was standing there. He wasn't someone I recognized from the building. Mid-40s, scruffy beard, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He looked off. Not drunk exactly, but jittery, like he was on something or hadn't slept in days. His hands were stuffed deep in his hoodie pockets, and he was shifting from foot to foot. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just stood there for a second, staring at the peephole, like he knew it. I was looking at him. "Hey," he finally said. His voice was low, casual, too casual. "Can you let me in? I'm visiting someone on this floor, but they're not answering." I didn't like this. The building has a call box for guests, and residents need to buzz people up. There was no reason he should have been on my floor, unless someone let him in already. "Who are you looking for?" I asked, stalling. He didn't answer that either. Instead, he leaned closer to the door, and his voice dropped even lower. "It's cold out here. Let me in, please." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. I didn't respond. A few seconds passed, and then he knocked again. Harder this time. "Hey, I know you're in there," he snapped. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building's security desk, but it went straight to voicemail. Typical. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? A man knocked on my door, and I felt creeped out. The knocking stopped. I checked the peephole again. He was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I double-checked the lock on the door and went back to the couch, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Around 11:30, I heard it again. Not a knock this time, a scratching sound. Faint, deliberate, coming from the direction of my door. I muted the TV and sat there frozen, straining to listen. The scratching stopped, but now I could hear footsteps. Slow, heavy, pacing up and down the hallway. I got up and peeked through the peephole. The man was back, but he wasn't alone now. Another guy had joined him, taller, wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap. They were standing by the door of the apartment across the hall, talking in low voices. The taller guy pulled something out of his pocket. It looked like a lockpick. I panicked. My neighbor across the hall wasn't home. I could see her door from my peephole, and I knew she'd left earlier that evening, all dressed up for a party. These men were trying to break in. My hands trembled as I called 911. I whispered into the phone, describing what I was seeing. The operator told me to stay on the line and keep my door locked. As I was talking, the taller guy must have noticed something. He turned and looked directly at my door, like he could see through it. "Someone's watching," he said to the other man. I could hear him clearly through the thin walls. We should go." They both walked away, disappearing toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. My heart was racing as I waited for the police to arrive. When they finally did, the men were long gone. The officers checked the building security footage and confirmed what I'd seen. The men had been loitering in the lobby for over an hour, waiting for someone to leave so they could sneak in. No one recognized them. The police told me I was lucky. Burglars like that don't usually stick to breaking and entering. Things can escalate if someone interrupts them. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but I didn't feel any safer. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the old building felt like a threat. I kept checking the security camera I'd hastily ordered after the incident. It's been a year, and I still don't trust the lock on my door. Now, every New Year's Eve, I stay hyper alert. I keep the lights on and the security feed open on my phone, and my phone in hand. I still don't know who those men were or why they chose my building, but one thing's for sure. They weren't just looking for a party. Last New Year's Eve, I was working a late shift at a diner on the edge of town. It's the kind of place that never really closes. A greasy spoon with fluorescent lights that hum louder than the conversations. Normally, it's quiet on holidays. Just a few truckers or the occasional lonely soul looking for a cheap meal. That night, though, something felt wrong. It was around 10:30 p.m. when he walked in. I noticed him immediately because of the mask. It wasn't a COVID mask or a ski mask. It was a full-face mask, the kind you'd find in a bargain Halloween aisle. White, featureless, like a mannequin's face. The hollow eye holes and the thin slit of a mouth made my stomach knot. The rest of him looked ordinary. Jeans, black hoodie, sneakers. But the mask made him seem off, like he didn't belong in the world the rest of us inhabited. I thought maybe it was some stupid prank, a drunk guy trying to be edgy. But he wasn't acting drunk. He moved slowly, deliberately, and sat at the counter without saying a word. "Happy New Year," I said, forcing a smile as I handed him a menu. My voice sounded too loud, even to me. "What can I get you?" Nothing. He just stared. Or at least, I think he did. The mask made it impossible to tell where his eyes were. Still, the tilt of his head felt deliberate, like he was studying me. "Sir?" I tried again. "Are you okay?" The silence stretched. I fought the urge to step back, to put distance between us. My coworker Dana leaned over and whispered, "What's his deal?" "I don't know," I murmured. "Maybe he's looking for attention." I forced a shrug. "You want to handle him?" "No way," she hissed. "You're the brave one." Brave. Right. I left the menu in front of him, hoping he'd take the hint and leave, but he didn't. He sat there, motionless, as if time had paused, just for him. Even the other customers noticed. A couple by the window paid their bill and left in a hurry, shooting nervous glances his way. At 11:15, he moved. Slowly, he pulled a small notebook from his hoodie and slid it across the counter. My fingers hesitated before I picked it up. On the first page, scrawled in jagged letters, was a single sentence. "Are you alone tonight?" My breath hitched. My hands trembled as I placed the notebook back on the counter. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm working with my coworker. She's right there." I gestured toward Dana, who gave a small, panicked wave. "Do you want something to eat or drink?" He tilted his head again, silent, watching. "Dana," I whispered, stepping back, "call the cops." She didn't hesitate. As she picked up the phone, I stayed rooted in place, my eyes locked on him. The humming fluorescent lights seemed louder, almost deafening. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. At 11:30, he stood abruptly, the screech of his stool against the tiles slicing through the tense quiet. He reached into his hoodie again. My throat tightened as his hand emerged, holding something shiny. A knife. "Stay back," I said, the words catching in my throat. "We've called the police. They'll be here any second." He didn't speak. He just tilted his head again, like he was weighing his options. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. I exhaled shakily, thinking it was over, but as he reached the door, he stopped. Slowly, he turned back, pointing the knife at me. "Midnight," he said. His voice was muffled, distorted by the mask, but clear enough to chill me to the bone. "I'll see you at midnight." The door swung shut behind him. Dana and I locked it immediately, our hands shaking. The police arrived soon after and searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. The masked man had vanished. We stayed locked inside until well past midnight, our eyes darting to the windows at every small sound, but he didn't come back. When my shift finally ended at 2 a.m., I walked to my car, exhausted and jittery. That's when I saw it, tucked under my windshield wiper. The notebook. My hand shook as I flipped it open. On the last page, written in the same jagged scrawl, was a final message. "Happy New Year. I'll be seeing you soon." I moved out of town a month later. I don't know if he ever followed me, but I haven't worked another New Year's Eve shift since. It was supposed to be the party of the year. My friend Mark had spent weeks planning his New Year's Eve bash. His backyard looked like something out of a Pinterest board. Twinkling lights wrapped the trees. A makeshift bar was stocked with every drink imaginable, and a cheesy photo booth stood ready for midnight pictures. I arrived at 9:30 p.m., dressed to the nines, and ready to let loose. Music and laughter spilled out of the house, and Mark greeted me at the door with a glass of champagne and his usual grin. "Make yourself at home," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "Midnight's going to be epic." And it was, at least at first. I danced like no one was watching, reconnected with old friends, and even struck up a conversation with someone new. The energy was contagious, and for a while I forgot about everything else. But around 11 p.m., I noticed him. The man in the hoodie. He stood near the corner of the living room, too far from the action to be part of it. The hood was pulled low, obscuring his face, but the way he carried himself made me uneasy. His dark jeans and plain sweatshirt looked out of place among the glittering outfits and party dresses. At first, I thought he was just shy, maybe tagging along with someone more outgoing. But the longer I watched, the stranger it seemed. He wasn't talking to anyone, he wasn't dancing or even smiling. He just stood there, sipping a drink, his head tilted slightly like he was watching the room through a lens only he could see. "Hey," I said to Jen, who was swaying next to me with a drink in hand. "Do you know that guy?" Jen followed my gaze and frowned. "I don't think so. Maybe he's with someone?" "Maybe," I said, though something about him made my stomach twist. The party blurred around me after that. I tried to focus on the conversations, the music, the countdown looming closer, but I kept catching glimpses of him. He moved like a shadow, slipping through doorways and weaving through the crowd, always on the periphery. At one point, I saw him standing in the hallway, staring at a group of people clinking glasses and laughing. He wasn't just watching, he was studying them, his head tilting slightly, like he was memorizing every movement. I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. I found Mark in the kitchen, pouring drinks with an exaggerated flourish. "Hey, Mark," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Who's the guy in the hoodie?" Mark frowned, looking up from the bottle. "What guy?" I gestured toward the living room, but by the time we got there, the man was gone. Mark laughed it off. Probably a friend of a friend. These things always attract extras. I tried to laugh with him, but the unease lingered. When I saw the man again, this time standing in the backyard, alone by the fence, It curdled into something darker. He was still, too still, as though he were waiting for something. The hood hid his face, but I felt his gaze, heavy and deliberate, even from across the yard. By the time the countdown to midnight started, I'd had enough. The party had turned too chaotic, too loud, and that man had spoiled the fun. I grabbed my coat and found Jen. "Hey, I'm heading out," I said. She frowned. "Already? Midnight's in like 2 minutes." "I'm not feeling it," I said, forcing a smile. "Text me tomorrow." She sighed but nodded, and I slipped out the front door. The cold air hit me like a wall, but it wasn't enough to cool the tension coiled in my chest. I pulled my coat tighter and froze. He was there. The man in the hoodie stood on the sidewalk, just a few feet from the house, his head tilted slightly, like he'd been waiting for me. I forced my feet to move, walking briskly to my car. My fingers fumbled with the keys as I unlocked the door and climbed inside, locking it behind me with trembling hands. When I glanced back through the rearview mirror, he was gone. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. Just some weirdo," I muttered, starting the car. But as I pulled onto the street, I caught a glimpse in the mirror again. A figure, walking down the sidewalk, heading in the same direction as me. My chest tightened. I pressed the gas pedal harder, turning down random side streets, hoping to lose him. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The lot was empty. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia. I was halfway to my front door when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't look back. My breath hitched as I bolted for the door, fumbling with my keys and throwing it open. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I stood there in the darkness, listening. The footsteps had stopped. The rest of the night was a blur of shadows and sounds I couldn't quite place. Every creak in the floor, every rustle outside the window set my nerves on edge. By morning, I convinced myself it was just some creepy guy from the party who followed me a little too far. But a few days later, I found the note. It was tucked under the windshield wiper of my car, written in jagged, uneven letters. "See you next year."